As the storm approached, the past came with it. The wind rustled through the dried grass as the sky loomed heavy and menacing. Dark gray clouds gathered over the ranch, ready to unleash a downpour at any moment. Thunder echoed from the distant hills, reverberating through the earth like a warning of something approaching. Standing inside the fence, Titan lifted his head slightly. The sounds that once echoed across battlefields now merged with the rumbling of the storm. His coat was weighed down by the rain, and his eyes were lost in a deep emptiness. He had once been a legendary warhorse, now he was nothing more than a forgotten shadow. The distant sound of an engine broke the silence of the ranch. A dust-covered old truck slowly approached the entrance. The man behind the wheel stared at the ranch as if he had seen a ghost. Daniel Carter. It had been years since he had set foot here. But now he was back. And the reason was the horse standing before him. The storm wasn't just in the sky, it raged within them too. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you in advance. The sky was heavy and somber, like an unbearable weight pressing down. Black clouds drifted over the hills like a silent army, moving with an eerie stillness. The howling wind carried the warning of an approaching storm. In the distance, thunder rumbled, echoing across the ranch's cracked and hardened soil, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Standing motionless inside the fence, Titan fixed his gaze on the horizon. He was no ordinary horse, once a legend whispered from mouth to mouth, a symbol of power and greatness. But now, with his scar-covered coat and a spirit that had long since faded, all that remained of him was a deep, unshaken silence. No one on the ranch dared to get too close. There was an invisible boundary around him, one drawn by pain, sealed by the past. The distant sound of an engine tore through the stifling air, shattering the silence of the ranch. A dust-covered old truck rumbled slowly toward the entrance, its worn-out metal groaning like a harbinger of the approaching storm. Behind the wheel, Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly. He was 38, but the lines on his face and the exhaustion in his eyes spoke of a weight far heavier than his years. His eyes were on the road, but his mind was lost in the past. It had been years since he had set foot on this ranch. After losing the army, his unit, and most of all his identity, he had never dared to return. His past was buried in this land just like the man he used to be. But now he was here. And there was only one reason that had brought him back: Titan. As soon as he stepped out of the truck, raindrops began to fall, landing heavily on his hat. The sky was preparing to wash over the land that had been silent for years, while Daniel took a shaky breath. His steps were cautious as he approached the fence, weighed down by the echoes of memories resounding in his heart. And there he was. Titan. Once he had been Daniel's battle companion. They had faced death countless times, surviving only by protecting each other. The wind carried distant memories that settled on Daniel's chest like an unbearable weight. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at Titan, remembering the horse's former glory, strength, and untamed spirit. But the horse standing before him now was no longer the Titan he once knew. What struck Daniel the hardest was the look in Titan's eyes. Empty. Deep yet lifeless. As if he remembered nothing, as if the man before him was just a stranger. That gaze, like an invisible blade to Daniel's chest, whispered the painful truth: his last remaining connection to the past had become nothing more than a fading shadow. Titan. Daniel whispered. His voice was so quiet that even he could barely hear it. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the knot in his throat. His fingers gripped the damp wooden fence tightly before he slowly reached out. A tiny spark of hope flickered inside him. Maybe, just maybe, Titan would remember him. Just a sign. The smallest reaction would be enough. But Titan didn't move. Worse, a flicker of fear appeared in his eyes as he took a step back and let out a sharp whinny. Rain washed over his trembling muscles as he instinctively pinned his ears back in unease. In that moment, Daniel's hope shattered. A shadow shifted in the distance. One of the ranch workers, Emma, had been watching silently. Ignoring the rain, she walked toward Daniel with slow, deliberate steps and lowered her head slightly. "He doesn't trust anyone," she said in a low voice. "Especially men. Something happened to him." Her words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Titan, who had once fought fearlessly, was now a broken, frightened animal. And though Daniel didn't know what had happened, he knew one thing for certain: he had to change that. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Titan. The rain pounded against his face and shoulders in heavy drops, but the storm within him raged even stronger. He knew exactly what this was. Why Titan was here, why he seemed so lost. No one understood the reason better than he did. The weight of the past pressed against his chest, and guilt coursed through his veins like poison. He remembered the promises he had made, the battles they had fought together. Titan had risked everything with him, but at some point, Daniel had turned his back on him. His fingers still gripped the wooden fence tightly. He exhaled a warm breath, straightening his posture against the rain. Then, as if making a vow meant only for Titan to hear, he whispered in a steady but gentle voice, "I won't let you down again, Titan." The horse still looked at him like a stranger. But Daniel was certain he would change that. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could make it right. The rain had turned the ranch's soil into a thick layer of mud. Puddles quickly erased the footprints left behind, as if the storm had claimed the land for itself. The wind howled against the barn's roof, carrying the damp scent of old memories through the air. But in the midst of the chaos, Daniel stood firm, rooted before Titan, lost in his past but unwavering in his resolve. That night, he was allowed to stay in one of the guest cabins on the ranch. But for Daniel, the night wasn't about rest. Lying on the bed, he stared at the ceiling, his mind crowded with ghosts of the past in the dim light of the room. Exploding bombs. Orders shouted over the deafening chaos. The screams of wounded soldiers. And in the middle of it all, Titan. Standing tall despite the bullets grazing his chest, despite the fire raining down around him, never taking a step back, his loyal companion through it all. That night, Titan had been the only thing keeping Daniel alive. But Daniel had left him behind. The crushing weight of guilt sat heavy on his chest, keeping sleep far out of reach. Now, even though they were under the same roof again, Titan didn't trust him. Maybe he had every right not to. But this time, Daniel wasn't going to walk away. He was going to fight not just for Titan but for himself. He would face his ghosts. He would earn Titan's trust again. Because if he didn't, he would never forgive himself. The first light of dawn spread over the ranch like a pale veil, following the relentless rain of the night. The air was still damp, the ground thick with mud, but Daniel's mind felt trapped in an even heavier darkness. The exhaustion of the night clung to his eyes, yet his steps remained steady. As he walked toward Titan, he barely felt the cool breeze brushing against his face. Titan stood in the same spot as the day before, motionless. His gaze was distant, his body tense. Daniel noticed that Emma had brought feed and water early that morning, yet Titan hadn't even approached the fence. He had to be hungry, he had to be thirsty. But it was as if he had completely severed his connection to the world around him. Leaning against the fence, Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Titan. Then, in a voice only the two of them could understand, he whispered, "I know you're still in there, Titan." His voice was soft, yet it carried an unshakable determination. His hands gripped the cold wood of the fence as his gaze searched Titan's dark eyes for a spark, a sign of recognition. "You're there. And so am I. But we're still in the fight, aren't we?" Silence drifted between them, carried by the wind. For a brief moment, Titan turned his head slightly, but he didn't pull away. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But maybe. It was a beginning. Titan's ears twitched ever so slightly. It was such a small movement that anyone else might have missed it. But Daniel saw it. A spark of hope, long buried beneath the ashes, flickered to life in his chest. It was the smallest reaction, but its meaning was immense. Titan was still there. He was just trapped by his fears, by the weight of the past. But that tiny response proved that the powerful spirit inside him wasn't entirely lost. Daniel didn't rush. He remained by the fence, his voice as steady and gentle as before. "I know you can hear me." Titan's eyes were still distant, but something stirred within them. The massive horse stood frozen in place, but he hadn't run. It wasn't an invitation. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Daniel took a slow, deep breath and waited in silence. Because if he truly wanted to bring Titan back, he had to help him learn to trust again. And that was a battle that would take time. Emma took a few curious steps forward, watching as Titan's ears twitched and Daniel stood unwavering, his gaze locked onto the horse. His body appeared calm, but in his eyes, another battle was raging. "You really know him?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with quiet skepticism. Daniel took a deep breath, pulling the crisp air into his lungs after the rain. He didn't look away from Titan as he spoke. "He saved me." Over and over again. His voice was low, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. This wasn't just a memory. Titan wasn't just a horse. He was the reason Daniel had made it through the war. His courage, his loyalty, they had kept Daniel breathing, even in his darkest moments. Emma heard the depth in Daniel's tone. For a second, she considered asking more, but she stopped herself. His past hung in the air like an unspoken secret, heavy and unrelenting. And Titan. Titan was the key to unlocking it. The ranch was quiet after the storm. But Daniel knew this was just silence. The real storm was only beginning. Daniel made a decision. He was done waiting, done being trapped by regrets of the past. If he wanted to get Titan back, he had to take the first step. Holding his breath, he unlatched the gate. The rusty hinges groaned softly as they moved. Titan's ears pricked up, his muscles tensed, but this time he didn't retreat. That was a sign. He was still on edge, still wary, but he wasn't trying to run. Daniel stepped inside, moving slowly. The mud beneath his boots squelched, but he paid no attention to it. Keeping his eyes locked on Titan's, he lowered himself onto one knee. His hands rested on his legs, his movements deliberate and controlled. He wasn't going to push him. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, worn leather strap. The edges were frayed, the color faded, but to Daniel it was priceless. It was the last piece of Titan's battle saddle. The strap had snapped the day Titan had gone down. Daniel had kept it ever since. Maybe, deep down, he had always known he would return. The moment his fingers brushed the strap, memories ignited in his mind. The scent of sand and gunpowder. The screams. The gunfire. And in the middle of it all, Titan shielding him from the chaos. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Daniel whispered in a shaky voice, "Do you remember this, buddy?" Titan's eyes flicked to the strap. For a moment nothing happened. Then, like a faint whisper on the wind, his nostrils flared ever so slightly. It was the smallest, most delicate reaction. But to Daniel it meant everything. The first connection had been made. A spark flickered in Titan's eyes, a brief, familiar glimmer, but just as quickly it faded. It was as if, for a fleeting moment, memories had surfaced, only to be buried once more. Daniel felt a pang in his chest. This wasn't the response he had hoped for. He had wanted to see his old, fearless companion return. But the emptiness in Titan's gaze whispered a truth he hadn't been prepared to face. Maybe Titan was trying to forget. Just like he was. For years, Daniel had fought to suppress those memories. The scars of war, the losses, the regrets. He had buried them deep, thinking that if he ignored them long enough they would disappear. But now, standing before Titan, he was forced to confront them all over again. They were the same. They carried the same weight, bore the same wounds, etched into different bodies. Daniel took a slow, steady breath. Whatever Titan had forgotten or wanted to forget, he couldn't force him to remember. But he could teach him to trust again. Because now Daniel understood. This fight wasn't just about bringing Titan back. It was about finding himself too. He bolted. Fear filled his eyes, his ears pinned back, his muscles tensed with terror. In that moment, Daniel understood. Titan remembered the war. As the helicopter blades sliced through the sky, Titan galloped frantically within the fence. Mud splattered beneath his hooves, his breathing came in sharp bursts. After all those quiet, empty days, the trauma inside him had finally erupted. Emma and the other ranch workers watched from a distance, frozen with fear. But Daniel didn't move. "Titan," he called out, his voice strong and clear. But Titan couldn't hear him. He was lost in the battlefield. Daniel hesitated for only a second, thinking of how to reach him. He couldn't restrain him, couldn't shout him into calmness. But there was one thing he could do. With deliberate steps he entered the pen. While Titan spun wildly in his panic, Daniel slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Just like on the first day. But this time he didn't pull out the leather strap. This time he trusted only one thing, his presence. He took a deep breath and spoke in a steady, gentle voice. "I'm here, Titan." "You're here. We're not at war anymore." Titan faltered for a moment. His breathing was erratic, his eyes wide with fear, but Daniel's voice had reached him. The man extended his hands slightly, making no sudden movements. The helicopter was still overhead, but in Titan's world, there was now something louder than the noise. Daniel's voice. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, Titan slowly turned his head toward him. The fear wasn't entirely gone, but something had changed. And that change was the only thing Daniel had given him. Trust. Titan kept spinning wildly within the fence, his hooves sinking into the mud, his powerful body trembling with panic. His fear was almost tangible, gripping him so tightly that the past had fully consumed him. Emma stepped forward, her eyes wide with worry. "Calm him down, Daniel. He's going to hurt himself," she shouted. But Daniel didn't move his eyes from Titan. He simply raised his hand. "No." His voice was calm but unwavering. "He's going to listen to me." The air grew still. Even Emma held back her words. Daniel's mind was clear. This wasn't a battlefield. but for Titan it still was. He took slow, deliberate steps forward, neither rushed nor hesitant. Titan's eyes were wide, his breath ragged, but he didn't run. Titan. Daniel's voice boomed like thunder inside the pen. It's over. That war is over. The helicopter still roared in the sky, but Titan's focus was locked onto him now. We're here, both of us, Daniel continued, his voice softer this time. But we're not on the battlefield anymore. Titan hesitated. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes still clouded with fear. But this time, beneath that fear, something else flickered, an ember of recognition, a moment of hesitation, as if he was finally hearing Daniel's voice. Slowly, Daniel extended his hand. No force, no demands. Only patience. Only the quiet understanding of an old friend waiting to be seen again. And then, Titan's massive body wavered slightly. The tension in his muscles began to ease. His breathing was still unsteady, but he had stopped spinning in frantic circles. For the first time, Titan seemed on the verge of breaking free from the chains of his past. For the first time he looked ready to return to the present. Titan kept whinnying, his voice still carrying the echoes of the storm. But then, for a moment he stopped. He took deep, unsteady breaths and locked eyes with Daniel. Those familiar eyes, the ones he had once trusted, the ones that had stood by him on the battlefield. Slowly, Daniel lifted his hands, palms facing upward, a silent promise that there was no threat, no force, no restraint. Only patience. Only the unspoken bond between them. Titan's breath trembled, but he took a step forward. Then another. His hooves sank into the mud, but this time he did not hesitate. And finally he lowered his head, pressing it gently against Daniel's chest. Daniel's heart pounded. He closed his eyes, feeling something inside him both break and heal at the same time. The years of weight, the guilt, the regret, they all seemed to lift, carried away by the silent trust of the friend he had once lost. His hands moved slowly, trembling as his fingers found their way into Titan's mane. He swallowed the knot in his throat and whispered, "I will never leave you again, buddy." It was a promise not just to Titan but to himself. From a distance, Emma raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Every doubt, every fear, every thought that Titan would never trust again. All of it vanished. Softly to herself she whispered, "This is incredible." And in that moment, it wasn't just a man and a horse standing in the rain. It was two lost souls finding their way back to each other. Titan kept whinnying, his voice still carrying the echoes of the storm raging inside him. But then, for a fleeting moment he stopped. He met Daniel's gaze. In those eyes he saw the past. Pain, regret, but above all, an unbroken bond. Daniel slowly raised his hands, palms up. A silent promise that he wouldn't force anything, that he would wait. He never had to push Titan. He had only ever stood by him. Titan took a step forward. Then another. His breathing was still heavy, his muscles still tense, but he wasn't running anymore. Slowly he lowered his head and pressed it against Daniel's chest. The walls inside Daniel cracked, just as the chains of fear that had bound Titan for so long began to break. He closed his eyes. For years he had carried the weight of guilt, of loss, but now for the first time that weight was lifting. He placed a hand on Titan's neck, his fingers trembling as they touched the warmth of his old friend's coat. One thought echoed in his mind, a promise meant for both of them, "I will never leave you again, buddy." From a distance Emma watched them. She didn't say a word. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears and a soft whisper escaped her lips, "This is incredible." And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, two lost souls, once trapped in the darkness of their past, had finally found each other again. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you in advance.